I just want to talk a little bit about tension on the wraps and what happens inside of there. When we tie the Bimini, we're taking this bite of line and we're twisting one around the other. And then we're taking the tag end and we're wrapping back over those twists with a barrel. And we're going all the way back to the loop and then finishing it off. Now, the reason that tension on these barrel wraps is so important is, imagine if you're holding onto this thing, onto these twists with a tight hand, you can put a lot of pressure on that and it's not going to slip. But if I hold on to this, to these twists loosely with my fingers, I'm just not putting much tension on them, this whole thing can slip. So when you look at a Bimini that's not properly tied and why it's slipping, there are my initial twists. And as I do these loose wraps around it, there isn't enough tension to hold this line. So when I pull on this, it basically becomes just a slip knot. And that loop doesn't stay the same size. So whatever I do with that loop, one leg is going to get shorter than the other. And basically, in real terms, what it'll become is a slip knot, where you'll slip everything out and you'll just be left with a straight line again with a bunch of twists in it. So the purpose of all those twists in the barrel wraps is to create this internal twist, and then around that have really tight barrel wraps that when you pull on it, won't slip. So here's an example of the difference between a properly tied Bimini and one that's improperly tied. The one that's improperly tied hasn't put a lot of pressure on the interior wraps. So if you cut it open, right here, we've got those outer barrel wraps, and those will kind of take off. And inside of those barrel wraps, we've got our twist. Now, this twist, we can untwist it pretty easily. And there are our two pieces that we've used inside of the Bimini to make the twist. Now, they are clearly twisted, but they're mostly round. That material has not fused together. Under pressure, that material is basically intact. It's showing a little bit of memory from being in that orientation wrapped around one another. If we take another Bimini that's been tied with much more pressure, and we do the same thing, we cut it here, and we cut the end off here. Those barrel wraps, we're going to undo. One thing to note is these two pieces are very hard to separate. And that's because they've been wrapped together like that, and then have been put under so much pressure from those barrel wraps that they're almost hard to get apart. So if I can just separate them a little bit. Now, I think I've about got it here. All right, there we go. So these two are interior wraps that have not been under a lot of pressure, and these two are interior wraps that have been under a lot of pressure. So this one on the top is mostly round. It's got the curves in it from being in that position, but on cross section, that thing is circular. This one on the bottom comes from the inside of that Bimini that was more tightly packed. And you can see this flat spot here where the material's actually been once again, looking for our word, deflected some and changed in its shape. If you move these around a little bit, this one is kind of round as we roll it. This one, if you try to change its orientation, you can see even right there, another part of it's been flattened. You can see some of the flat part here. So this just goes to show what happens to these two. It's the same material from the same spool of monofilament. This one has been changed seriously, and this one is still round but slightly different. A lot of what happens inside of a knot we can see by what's left over after we break it. And a really good way, if albeit a little bit dorky, is to get a microscope and you can see the difference.